Hello and welcome to the Chemistry Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Macario, and this is the podcast where you get chemistry confident and we take you from point A to grade A. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. I hope you're really well and that your studies are going well too. Before we start today's episode fully, I wanted to say a big thank you to my patrons whose support helps make this show possible. Okay, so what are we talking about today? We're going to be talking about what happens when we introduce basic quantum mechanics to the atomic model. And this introduction of that concept into your chemistry education typically happens in the last stage of high school education. So here in the UK, this might be when you start to study A-level or advanced higher chemistry. If you're outside the UK, why not tell me when you start to think about quantum mechanics in your chemistry studies? I'd like to hear about that. Okay, so what does introducing quantum mechanics do to the atomic model? Well, it affects understanding of the shape of atoms, shape of the periodic table. It introduces new concepts within atomic structure. Before we consider quantum mechanics, we just consider atoms to have shells, and we'll be introducing subshells and orbitals into that model too. And then we'll talk about what is it about quantum mechanics? What are we introducing that makes these changes to the way that we're viewing the simpler atomic model? So firstly, what's the change to the shape of atoms? Well, prior to the point where we introduce quantum mechanics, we have quite a basic model, which is almost a two-dimensional model. We consider the nucleus and orbiting around that shells of electrons, almost like a solar system in as much as the electrons are orbiting around the nucleus in a fixed pattern at a fixed distance. And that, as we'll find, is very much an oversimplification, but it's something that we needed in order to introduce the concept of different energy levels within atoms. What else? Well, we're also going to talk about the shape of the periodic table. So again, our basic model tells us that the first shell of electrons has 2 electrons, and the second, third, and so on have 8 electrons in each. That works fine for the first 20 elements. But then we find actually, if you look at the periodic table, you'll see that if you count the number of elements across the periodic table, as you go down the periodic table, you'll see there are more than 8 elements across the periodic table, which means there must be more than 8 electrons possible within those electron shells. So what we will find is actually each shell has more capacity for electrons. It can take more electrons than the previous shell. So the first shell does have the possibility of taking 2 electrons. The second has capacity for 8, and they grow larger than that too. We'll also introduce the concept of orbitals and subshells. I mentioned a few moments ago that we view the shells such that each shell is a single energy level, and that all electrons within that shell are effectively the same, doing the same thing in the same way. In fact, what we'll find is there are things called orbitals within the shells, and that there are types of orbitals, and those have slightly different energy levels, and they give us different three-dimensional shape to the atom and to the way it bonds with the other atoms around it as well. Now, most of the orbital types exist in multiple numbers within each shell, and therefore we have something called a subshell where we metaphorically group together the same orbital type within a particular shell. And all this is happening because we're introducing very basic quantum mechanics, and we'll start to consider 4 quantum numbers of electrons. Those quantum numbers correspond to certain properties of the electron, such as which energy level it's in, its subshell, and something called spin. And we'll go into that in more detail in another episode. So what have we talked about today? We've mentioned that the basic atomic model we've studied so far doesn't include quantum mechanics, and now at this stage we're going to start thinking about quantum mechanics. There is quantum numbers related to electrons that we're going to start considering. The effect of that quantum theory and the quantum numbers that we'll be considering tells us something about the detail of the energy levels, the orbital shape and other properties of the electron, and therefore the shape of the atom overall. And it also tells us that different shells have different capacity for the number of electrons they can take and that is a growing capacity as we go down the periodic table, as we increase the number of shells. Okay, I do have a PDF you can download on this topic. And if you would like to get hold of that, just go to chemistrymadesimple.net/2, that's the number 2. And I will also put that link in the show notes. If you still have any simple questions on this topic, or you'd like to know more about how you can work with me on this or any other chemistry topic, then please do get in touch with me. The best place to do that is on Instagram at Chemistry Made Simple. And I do look forward to hearing from you and hopefully working with you to help you more too. So that's the end of this episode. I look forward to speaking with you again next time. Look after yourself and goodbye. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you found it useful, and if you have had value from it, do consider visiting our Patreon community at patreon.com/chemistrymadesimple, where you'll be able to ask deeper questions about this topic and get more support for your studies too. So I look forward to speaking to you again in the next episode, and until then, do look after yourself and goodbye.